Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Walter Pasquarelli. I'm a manager within the Tech and Society practice area of Economist Impact. I'm excited to welcome our audience to today's webinar, Empowering Businesses for Tomorrow, Decoding the Digital Future in Germany. It's the second webinar in our series on digital future readiness. How future ready is our business? For decades, this has been a question that executives have asked themselves. But in 2020, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, this question obtained a whole new meaning, and digital preparedness became a vital prerequisite for business success. In this context, the German environment has been incredibly interesting. As part of my work, I've spent quite a significant amount of time in benchmarking countries' business environments. And across all of these studies, Germany consistently sticks out as a country that has a lot of potential. But the question is, how do we turn this potential into future readiness? We're now looking at a future where COVID made digital preparedness a must. And with a new coalition government coming in, there could actually be new policy momentum for digitization efforts in Germany. This is the larger context in which our discussion takes place today. I want to thank Wipro Limited for making this discussion possible, as well as our excellent set of panelists joining us today. And I'm pleased to introduce Michael Seiger, Country Head and Managing Director of Germany and Austria of Wipro Limited, Nancy Nemesh, Managing Director of Nemesh Ventures and founder of Humanize and Meta Epic, Malik Rao, Chief Technology and Information Officer and Board Member of Telefonica Germany, and Stefan Eberhardt, Global Chief Information Officer at Mercedes-Benz Mobility AG. I would like to open up this discussion with just a very simple question to our panelists. And put simply, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, how important has digital preparedness become for your organization? And Michael, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Let me start with a number. It's 10. It has been 10 in the past. It's even 10 plus now. And because for us, we sell digital products, we deliver digital products, and we rely on them. And we have seen this more important than ever. And it starts with connectivity and user computing, just to be connected to clients and employees.
Great. Nancy, 10 is shows that it's quite important. Is that do you share this view? Is it would you give it a 10 as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give it a 10. Also working in this space for so many years and seeing how important technology digitalization has been over the years to enhance people's lives, to really drive well-being for people. And I do believe that the most important aspect in high tech and technology is driving trust. And we'll talk about that later. But trust,
Absolutely.
in my opinion, is the number one item. And it should be the number one value as we employ digital technologies, being, trust in tech, trust in politicians, trust in people, trust in each other. And so therefore the human element, I think, is at the core of driving technology.
Fantastic. Malik, how would you assess this?
Absolutely. I mean, if you had any better score than 10, I would have taken that with both hands. Honestly, I mean, we've been living in the technology industry and communication. I'm super proud to be part of this industry right now in the pandemic, when flights were not flying, cars were not on the road, but telecommunication was so critical. As Nancy mentioned about trust, trustful communications where people rely on you and you're able to contribute to society. That we feel proud of being here.
Fantastic. And moving on to Stefan, 1 to 10, how would you rate the digital preparedness for your organization?
Yeah, I mean, if you would allow me, I would give an 11. So I think it is super important here for us as well, both as Mercedes-Benz as well as within Mercedes-Benz Mobility, where I'm responsible for. So, in the car business, there's 3 major priorities. One is becoming electric. Second would be being sustainable, but third would be also being 100% digital. And why is that? I mean, because we actually need to inspire our customers in the best possible way, and they are in the meantime digital. They are not just using digital devices. We need to kind of get all what is the sales and after sales journey, including financing and leasing, in a fully digital way. And also internally, I mean, in terms of looking into our processes, and there is nothing possible without the use of digital technology.
Excellent. Yeah, that's such a relevant point, and I feel especially. I mean, what has come clear, just like from this very brief question, is that um, everyone rates the importance of digital preparedness at least a 10. Stefan rates it as an 11. So it seems to be that this is going to be an area of absolute priority for the future. But the question is, of course, well, how did we get here, right? And so I would like to really proceed now to sort of the the process that happened before we get to this point. And so, and Michael, I would like to start with you again because you were very quick in providing us with a 10 actually in terms of digital preparedness. What has been the impact of the pandemic in all of this? How has this changed that sort of your organization thinks about the future?
Yeah, Walter, thanks for this question. Yeah, and I stated 10 plus was my rating. And how, yeah, especially if you mentioned Germany and Austria leading, but we look at, or working with our clients, we have seen that for many of them, the pandemic was as well a wake up call. They realized the maturity and the extent to which they were digitized. And there are three main areas here where it's obvious. The back office, or the processing. Second, how you interact with your clients and partners. And third, how you interact with your employees. And since people couldn't go to the office, clients didn't come to stores any longer, you had to act fast. Yeah? And there we saw very interesting maturity curves, even global champions who were not at the level where they're supposed to be. And now we see COVID as a large trigger to improve this. Just to give you one example, a bank who we are dealing with, they realized that they need to send the people to the office because simply the back office systems were not as automated and people had to be physically around still scanning documents. And this is just one example. And we see right now a lot of traction in these companies. First, to cope with the leftovers, what hasn't been done in the past, but already thinking the next step ahead.
Thank you, Michael. And I think this is especially an interesting point, especially the point of a wake-up call or trigger. So there seems to be really an inflection point where the pandemic hit in. And Stefan, I would like to pick this up with you because I think you mentioned, for example, just a minute ago about digital preparedness in terms of internal capabilities, external capabilities with customers. Is this something that has this changed during the pandemic? Or has this been sort of a long road in preparation for it, and the pandemic was just a trigger, so to speak?
Well, I'd say rather an accelerator. So, I mean, it is not that that is new to us, and we have been kind of paving the way also for quite some time. Also, to give you a personal example on that one. So, I mean, in the middle of the pandemic, I returned from abroad. And I wanted to kind of change just my postal address with some of the banks around and insurance companies. And you don't know how hard it is to get that done. I mean, we are still in a phase where parts need to go to a kind of a physical bank outlet to kind of do that with some copies of your passport and you name it and so on. And it's not always easily being possible that you can do that digital in the meantime. And it is actually a painful process, and we need to learn out of that. And this is where I see pandemic really as an accelerator in terms of further kind of bring digital, flexible, intuitive, efficient interactions into play, so that we really kind of can better interact with our customers. But also, I would underline that we also need to look into how we are prepared in our offices, in our businesses, because people more and more do not want to stay for 5 days a week, 8 hours or 10 hours a day on their workplace. They want to kind of do that also more flexible, more remotely. And therefore, we also need to bring in the technology in order to enable and allow that.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm finding it fascinating really to sort of see the typology of the impact that the pandemic has had. Accelerator as well is something that I think is one that has come many times, and sort of one of the when we conduct research into understanding businesses' perspective and how it changes, and that is interesting because Nancy, I know that you have spent a long time working in high tech, first of all as an executive, then as an entrepreneur and investor. And so I think you've been really also like exposed just right from the beginning into this sort of digital acceleration. Has it now become a greater priority? This is something that you feel as well since 2020, or is it something that maybe was there all the time, but really just picked up just a couple of years ago?
What a great question, Walter. I would almost say a little bit of both, to be honest. Technology has been there for many years. We talk about artificial intelligence today as it would have been new, but it is here since the 50s, right? Except we are making progress at a pace that maybe not always is what we have dreamed of. But to your point, I think the pandemic has really speeded the adoption of technology by several years. So without the pandemic, we have probably not have seen companies being pushed over this technology tipping point, right? And I was recently reading a executive survey done by McKinsey, where they were saying that companies have accelerated the digitization of their customer and supply chain interactions and also internal operations by 3 to 4 years. So that gives you, right, some of that answer. And secondly, they said the share of digital products in organizations' portfolios has accelerated by 7 years just because of the pandemic. So to your point, the changes have happened much quicker than anyone thought possible before the crisis. And we expect this changing to be long lasting. And you can see that there is funding, just like we've heard from Mercedes-Benz, there is funding and it will accelerate funding for digital initiatives. Most of the companies are increasing that more than any other investment right now. So it's not just increasing in number of, but also in number of people in technology roles. That's really important to understand. It's not just investing in technology, but also in skilling, reskilling, upskilling of employees.
I would like to touch upon this topic about sort of new talent hiring just in a minute, because I think this is crucial. And just before we wrap up this first theme in our webinar, Malik, I know that we've kind of now talked about, well, is technology something that had already started, technological acceleration something that started before, or was it always there? But now some technologies are being adopted quite clearly. So I'm curious to hear, going forward now, as we look into this new future, what do you think are sort of maybe one or two key trends that are shaping the business landscape of tomorrow?
I think a few things. I mean, just to add what Stefan and Nancy said about accelerating in terms of the consumer needs. The customer needs a contiguous and pervasive experience. The demand of the services is so pervasive. The technologies were there earlier. However, the acceleration of technologies into our domains is significantly changing. For telecommunication, it's been like we normally plan the future at least 10 years ahead or 15 years ahead, because when we buy a spectrum by paying billions of euros, if you don't have a plan of future, you will not be able to survive. So, however, what pandemic taught us is you have to build the future by qualifying every day. If you can't qualify every day excellence, you cannot be surviving tomorrow. So I think pandemic is something which, at least for me, the learning is you have to have the qualification every day. It has to be every day in, day out, in trustful experience for the customer, and while building the future. So that is the big change which I see. I was doing a quarter on quarter, month on month plan, but today we have to do day by day plan.
Excellent. And I think that's actually a really interesting point. Just before we move on to this next section, it does sound like, yes, we can look into the future. We need to have this bigger picture in mind. But of course, the changes that have to be made and sort of the investments are of course incremental. So we need to take today's challenges, address them while still, as Malik, you just said, like keeping this larger picture in mind, which is something that a lot of tech executives in these past years have been doing successfully. And really, now let's move to the next segment of this webinar. And I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on this, which is harnessing digital technologies. And um, let's just start again with Nancy, because I think you brought like some really interesting insights. And what, in your opinion, what has been the role of digital technologies in helping businesses navigate really this time of disruption in these past 2 years?
Yeah, well, basically, clearly, without technology, we could not have seen the response. Even though we are still very critical on some of the response mechanisms we've seen and how they have been implemented, technology has clearly impacted very much what the response has been. And I would say the most important aspect here is that companies have realized that they need to accelerate adoption, and therefore, increasing investments. Again, as we said earlier, investing more in skilling, and I know you want to touch on that a bit later as well.
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing working with global customers is that the focus on workforce transformation has been very big. And so that I think is the number one impact really was people in technology roles, but also people that are not yet in technology roles but could get there is one of the most important changes that you can see happen. So I would say again, I'm saying this often, I think the focus on the human, that will take away some of the fear and also critical thinking around adopting technology faster if we really understand how it will enable and not just challenge people. But there are challenges as well. So
Very interesting. Stefan, is this something? Is this an experience that you share as well in terms of the role of digital technologies in supporting businesses throughout this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's true during these times, but also more in general. So, I mean, if you really look into what can be better utilized in terms of technology to make a more, let's say, fluid experience, we need to really kind of bring in new technology. So, I mean, in the past, we experienced more that we have kind of, fragmented processes where we tried to digitize them. And so I would also agree in terms of looking into a bigger picture in terms of how can we sustainably make use out of data, for example. How can we better leverage the technology in terms of, for example, bringing workflow engines in where we can kind of have support for end-to-end processes, where we can gain better data insight into what we have on hand. Again, looking into the situation pre-pandemic, now still somewhat in pandemic, and then after that, I think it's still accelerating. And I feel that it was kind of like an external impulse to kind of, if not already happened, to wake us up to go down that line. It would have come anyway.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned as well, which brings me to Malik as well, sort of this idea of the bigger picture and how sort of like with the pandemic, we've all been like sort of pushed by sort of maybe a decade ahead. And Malik, is this especially? I'm interested to hear in Germany, especially. Is this is do you feel as well that digital technologies has been sort of this key factor of support in sort of navigating the pandemic? Is this an opinion that you share?
I think pre-pandemic, if I look at from a technology perspective or from a Germany perspective, right? One is technology perspective. Of course, it's implemented along in different countries. However, when I was looking at Germany a few years back, the digital consumption was significantly, say, lower compared to some of the countries. However, post-pandemic, it's a significant change. Significant change, why I say is, picking up from a human perspective, right? How people have evolved, how people have changed. The biggest example which strikes me is the way a country or the people adopted the digital technologies. In my own as a company, the work council normally need to meet physically to pass some of the resolutions. There was definitely a process in Germany. However, the pandemic came in within few days, meant precisely 24 hours. The whole company said we need to move online. We have thousands of agents who comes into the call center to support, and everybody goes home. So the bureaucracy or the kind of process which was there, the adoption of process quickly in 24 hours is a significant change. So I see this country, the community style of adoption is significantly big, but however, it is still moving with very caution, right? So that's how I see it as a country.
So we could,
Technologies, yeah,
Malik, we could really talk almost like about a cultural change in this case, right?
absolutely, absolutely. It's a significant change, significant cultural change.
Yeah.
And normally I say we're good in adopting technologies. Even if I look at my mobile networks kind of, or maybe technology side of the connectivity, you have 2G, 3G, 4G, or 5G, or 6G, we will adopt. However, we were not very good at disruption.
Yeah.
And pandemic acts as one of the disruptor for us. And this is also a significant change in the culture and significant change how people have started thinking about it. It's disruption.
Right. Yeah. And Michael, because I know you shared a couple of interesting thoughts about this as well. I know previously you said that as a result of the pandemic, we went through something that you described as a revolution in culture, right? A revolution that is changing business cultures and strategies, which I think is the sort of the emphasis on the cultural element is, I think, a fascinating point, especially because many times in technology adoption, we say that since ultimately organizations are about people, we often find that the biggest change actually happens or needs to happen at the cultural level. In this revolution, as you described it, what role do digital technologies play in preparing businesses for the future?
Thanks, Walter, for this question. Usually I have I had my favorites pre-pandemic, but the first thing that stands out is digital workplace. Yeah, it was a pretty boring stuff some years ago because you had a desktop, it had to work, you had to print. But if you see this nowadays, like us now, also on this call, we are communicating virtually. And it starts with the employees. The first experience all new joiners in many companies over the last 18 months had was when they unpacked their laptop, their phone, and started to explore who's around them, where are the colleagues, who are the colleagues,
Yeah.
and also all the other applications around them. Yeah, so that's a completely new way of working. In the past, it has been the office space, the travel, the restaurants, and that's probably the number one change I've seen. That this matters so much. For that reason, we've also now recently announced to open digital workplace experience center in Munich for Europe, where we will not just show work from everywhere, but also how the different aspects of the of certain industry, whether it's point of sales, whether it's a manufacturing desktop work. Yeah, that's number one. In this context, of course, what needs to be always observed is the security, because Malik mentioned it. While a lot of companies, and also we moved probably over a 2 weeks time frame, 220,000 people around the globe from the offices to the home. Security is the number one topic that is also considered to be a threat in this. Yeah, and this needs to be well balanced out. But I think personally, and also Malik, you being at Telefonica 10 years ago, this would have been impossible because simply the bandwidth, the technology would not have been there. And from that perspective, it was at least we came prepared as a society, as we had the technology fundamentals in place
Great, and it's an interesting point, especially you mentioned cybersecurity, and it kind of implies something also about choosing and prioritizing the areas in which sort of we need to invest in order to increase our digital preparedness. And it's interesting. As part of my role, I speak a lot to executives that have laid out a vision for digital preparedness. Um, but a question that they ask me over and over again is, well, which areas should I invest in? And Stefan, I know you've mentioned a couple of really interesting points about, first of all, investing in sort of like some talent internally, making sure that all the infrastructure is in place. And so, how can businesses decide which investments to make in technology? What is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, maybe two things. Number one, more like from a controlling perspective. So what we do is we do not invest into technology just for the sake of investing into technology. That doesn't make any sense. But what we do is we carefully calculate the value of technology, what we can create with bringing technology in. So being that on the one side, creating additional value streams in terms of additional services, better services, increased customer experience, and so on and so forth. And then on the other side, also the efficiency in our internal processes. So, I mean, there is a methodology around where you can do really that sort of math, and where you can say, well, it is worthwhile investing. And at the same time, also, you need to look into your old portfolio of applications where you say, well, where do I also actively disinvest then? Because, of course, you need to balance somehow your budget, which you have, and it is not endless. That is the one point. The other one is, I think it becomes very, very clear that we all need to invest into tech capabilities within our people, within our organization, because otherwise we will not be able to consistently drive innovation and to fully understand what is needed and how to implement that. And we need to do that, by the way, not just in the IT department. We need to do it across the enterprise and on all levels of the enterprise. So I think that is still very well invested money into kind of really skill up digital capabilities.
Right. So that's really interesting. I want to take the conversation now a bit into the data aspect of things, as we talk about technological enablers. And I know in Germany, I'm speaking a lot to policymakers at the moment. We're discussing the establishment of a so-called data institute, basically responsible for making sure that there could be a wider sharing and a wider uptake of data-driven technologies across industry. And Malik, this is really a question for you, as I know you touched upon this previously, but do you see or do you feel that there is a centrality of data when we talk about businesses' future readiness?
Absolutely. I mean, data is continued to be playing a big, part of every decisions what we make. However, at a global policy level, right? Germany, I mean, one change which I see is about the data privacy, data sovereignty, data security, right? So these are the topics which came up in a big time. And at the same time, you have the demand from a customer perspective that, okay, you have the pandemic which is there. How do you really want to help people while you want to keep the privacy of individual absolutely safe, absolutely non-compromised? And how do you manage this with the technology evolution which is happening, let's say specifically for 5G or disasters, like in the eastern part of Germany when we had these floods last year, right? I mean, how does the data help the society? How does data help the customers? That's where a lot of rethink in terms of how do you architect the data? How do you really deliver a service specific for the individual users while keeping the data sovereignty in place for European Union or Germany and regulations? And there is definitely a lot of change which is happening. And all the new technologies, when it comes to 5G, I mean, if you have a critical service delivered on the network, unless you know the customer, unless you know the service, but you can't anonymize everything. So there is a lot of disruption. There is a lot of rethink about how should the data sovereignty, data integrity discussions evolving. I mean, we are learning as we go right now. Yeah, so that's why I'm seeing on the data. When data dependent or data say driven decision making have always been part of our life, specifically in communication industry, because we hold a significantly large amount of data with responsibility, as Nancy mentioned, in terms of trust. People trust you. We are not an internet company where I can use consumer as a rather customer as a consumer, or a customer as a commodity. We can't do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the promise we make to the customer.
And that brings me as well, sort of like we're looking at sort of the data and the promises that we can make with this data, right? So we can deliver X service, but we cannot deliver this service. And that what Nancy, this is really a nice segue actually to a question I've been wanting to ask you. And that's sort of continuing this argument. We've now talked about some of the talent. We've talked about some investments that need to happen. We've talked about the data sovereignty and availability. And these are questions that come up all the time when we talk about digital preparedness. And a lot of our research, it's one of the main insights that always comes out. But I would be curious to hear your opinion now on, well, yes, technology presents a huge opportunity, but what are the limitations of it? Do you see something that we cannot achieve? What conditions basically need to be put in place for us to make this a success for our businesses?
Yeah, well, this is a really good question. And I'm a digital optimist, and sometimes I call myself a digital Darwinist. So I'm on the positive side of technology, also having a conscious bias that technology helps more than harms if we manage it correctly. And just before I answer your question, I'm really happy to see both Malik and Stefan, and actually everyone was talking about the culture. It's so important, as we become data-driven businesses, as we become more technology focused, it's so important to drive that culture of using business intelligence and data to make better business decisions. So that's number one. Now, moving into the limitations, there are many, right? So again, being on the positive side, of course, you have to be very cautious about those limitations. I want to give you maybe just two. First of all, I think it really depends on the size of the enterprise. We see here Stefan and Malik and everyone really representing large enterprises. So the complexity and scale of large or most enterprises today creates a major challenge when it comes to data. And so, progressive use of technology, we've heard before, transforming a small business with data and, let's say, artificial intelligence is far simpler than embedding a data first culture across a multinational organization. So that is, we first need to know, do we have the right data to transform and digitalize our business? And if yes, is it of necessary quality? So that's one big challenge. Once we know the right data is available, it's not enough to just have data. The next step is to make sense of all that data. And so that volume of data, as we've heard also from Telefonica, makes this task really, really hard. And so if you look at the numbers, more than 60% of organizations today say that at least half of their data volume is not even captured. So they're not clear what data exists. So that's one limitation, right? And I would go back again to that point with the second limitation, that many organizations face a cultural challenge when changing these behaviors towards high tech and of course towards data or AI. So what I've observed, if an executive team in a company has a history of ignoring facts or has no trust in the information provided in reports, by the data I have, then it's going to be difficult to move towards technology.
Yeah.
And not at the necessary speed, right? So that would be the second limitation. It's truly believe in those possibilities and the successes and really truly driving that cultural challenge. And so I think we can solve those issues. These are just two of the issues. We can solve them, but to really understand how do we solve them. really understand the overall strategic direction of the company, really understand how we make major decisions, and how we leverage technology, just like Stefan said, but also really identify the data needed to support those decisions.
Right.
So I truly believe it's about the data first culture that we have to build.
It sounds, Nancy, really that to wrap this discussion up as well, and before we move to the next section, that like harnessing digital technologies as well, of course, about the technical capabilities that need to be put in place. But next to that, of course, we do really have the cultural element, which has come out of this discussion multiple times, that really needs to be put in place as well. So thank you. I would like to move on now to the final segment of this discussion, which is we've now looked at the past. We've now looked at then the role that technology has played, and what is of course now that needs to happen for us in order to prepare for the future. And I know, Michael, you have mentioned a couple of really interesting points already of how Wipro is dealing with this, especially in relation to sort of the future of work and create flexibility for employees. And so something that I'm particularly interested to hear is to what extent do you think actually can companies prepare for the future?
Yeah, thanks, Walter. Yeah, that's an interesting question. If I would have a crystal ball in front of me, I would give you a crisp answer. But this already leads me also to what I see, because we heard many times about the new normal. And the new normal, what we see and also believe is be prepared for the unexpected. Yeah, that does not mean there's no steady state. But and there are three things where we are right now focusing on. Number one is resilience, and resilience means really be more flexible and agile. And this is, we heard it, I mentioned it, the wake up call. We lived now many years in a way that, we planned yesterday for tomorrow, and it was a bit of steady state. Yeah, and now we see pandemic and also political crisis coming up, and positively it keeps us awake. Yeah, and of course we need to cope with effects. Yeah, so number one is resilience, but then to come prepared, there are two other things which are needed, and this is talent and innovation. And talent is then people who understand the business, who master the technologies. And Stefan mentioned this also. It needs to be purposeful and translate this into solutions, whether it's data, AI, and we have fantastic examples there, what technology could drive in terms of benefits, not only on the monetary side, but also to avoid waste, to improve the harvesting in agriculture, and get more out of it with less input. And last but not least, also a structured way in driving innovation. We heard it a lot, yeah. The question also about this is technology driving business innovation, or is business innovation business driving technology innovation? And these are the three overarching themes I personally believe, will be key for our future and for companies like us and for our clients to come prepared.
Thank you. And Michael, one point I really want to follow up on, which I think is really interesting. It's about the topic of sustainability. For example, you mentioned like some capabilities that can then be implemented to sort of improve harvesting and reduce waste. Would you say that today, going forward, um, is digital preparedness? Would you put it as the another side of the same coin, essentially, of sustainability, or how would you assess the relationship between the two?
On the one hand side, they come next to each other, like cloud. Yeah, cloud is not only cost saving or being more agile. We also see clearly that it's reducing, or that it brings us closer to our net zero objectives, which we have stated. And secondary also, I mentioned a couple of those. Yeah, it's not just about creating new products, but also being more conscious about society and environment. And I would I fully underwrite this, yeah, that we have a couple of other examples. Let's take the energy sector, which is so important. To store electricity is still a major challenge, and therefore to manage also, like in a prosumer market, demand and supply, not to waste energy and to direct it where it's required, is a major challenge. And we have, for example, a client where we're actively engaging with, yeah, also to build the energy operating system of the future. And yes, the answer is clearly beyond the typical carbon reduction, which comes out of the data centers,
Right.
which also is a major paradigm. We see that technology can also help to help to meet the targets for carbon emission, and even beyond that, simply taking care about our environment, about our society, but also about people. Let's not forget about this. We also have a mandate for the people who live on this earth to provide them with a better earth. And this is, by the way, also a key cultural element of our company, because and there I'm very proud here to work for such a company like Repro, because 2/3 of all the benefits or the company earns, yeah, is invested into a fund that cares about people and society.
Thank you, Michael. I think this is really a great answer that provides really a comprehensive picture as well. Not only on sort of using, as I think Stefan mentioned earlier, not using only technology for the sake of technology and like sort of digital acceleration, but also looking sort of beyond the larger picture that we have, that sort of we as a business community and as a society face as well. And uh, Nancy, I think you mentioned a couple of really interesting points earlier, especially when we talked about trust, when we talked about the limitations of technology. And now that we're looking sort of more at the topic of preparation for the future, again, like what is sort of the to what extent, now that we have so many responsibilities also in front of us and so much uncertainty, to what extent can companies actually prepare for the future?
The most difficult question, right? Absolutely key question for everyone to think about and to discuss in a collaborative way. I believe we all have to think about the next steps, right? In a way, we mentioned even the workforce transformation, what happens in future. We spoke about remote work as well. I think in general, what is important, back to the point of trust, is that we keep people engaged. And to keep people engaged, so there is no, we were talking about digital fatigue a lot these last years. Even, people first got excited about, working remotely and maybe having some more time for the family, but very quickly it became clear that we need to balance these things. So I think in order to keep ourselves engaged, first of all, we have to highlight the company values and make them a core part of communication. I think really that's a very important item. The second, I would say, leverage diversity for deeper engagement, not just to make up numbers, but really drive diversity of everything. I'm not talking gender, I'm talking, diversity of thought, of background, of critical thinking, of communication, and of course, cultural diversity. And also, I think a very important item, again, back to the human element, look at employees' well-being really honestly. I think workers' health, especially now, during and after the pandemic, many people got that crazy virus got infected. And I think it's becoming very clear that to have a brighter future, we have to care about workers' health. And that should be our priority. To give you an example, both at Microsoft and Google, where I've been working for about 20 years, there are very honest programs and efforts for the well-being of employees. And I think that's really important. And then engage the employees and all of us in a dialogue, for which I thank you also for this discussion. I've learned a lot from the other speakers and from you, Walter, just by the way we're thinking about things, become truly a learning organization, involve people in this giving and getting feedback. So I think these are really some of the most important elements for the future.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I think this is really enlightening. And Malik, we've kind of mentioned a few things now, right? So we've mentioned earlier the fact that an organization needs to be data driven. We've mentioned now, as Michael said as well, the fact that through some technologies we can become an organization that is more environmentally conscious and responsible. And similarly, Nancy also now just mentioned the fact that there are certain limitations and there is a responsibility not for the wider environment, but also for the well-being of employees. What do you think are sort of some further characteristics that can really define the businesses of tomorrow? What does the business of the future, in your opinion, look like? What does it bring to the table?
Yeah, I mean, what I see, or what I'm looking at what's happening, the big changes are basically none of us have a solution what is needed for the customers in a single company. Let's say Telefonica or any company don't have solutions for all the problems. Unless we start co-creating, unless we start working together as an ecosystem to solve the problems. Earlier, we were just thinking about how do I solve a customer problem in a specific segment. Now, today, there is no segment. Every customer is a segment of one. Customer, whether it is individual, whether it is large enterprise or small enterprise, everybody has a unique needs. Now, when I'm looking at it, I a lot of times think about it, how can we build solutions? The only answer I come back is, I don't have a single company cannot be able to deliver a solution. Let's work together. When Michael spoke about the planet, right? When we promised ourselves that we want to be responsible company, responsible corporate, however, we can't solve this problem alone, right? So that is how we started changing significantly. That's number one. The second thing, what I also see is all of us as managers or leaders have all the priorities are important. There is no priority if I take my entire organization or the future of technology, everything looks to be important. But how do you prioritize? And then once you prioritize, how do you over-invest on certain things? For example, in Telefonica, we decided we will over-invest on people and culture because that is fundamental of delivering an experience for the customer. That's a fundamental of delivering or using technology to innovate. That's where we said we want to over-invest on people and culture. Right? Allow people to have a federated intelligence is more important than individual brilliance. So that is a bit of change which I see to be organization need to be prepared for these kind of changes. Technology is there, technology will be there. That's the least of the problem, right? When I look at even as a technologist, technology is the last thing in my mind. The first thing in my mind is how can I adopt, how can I disrupt, how can I change? And that's a bit of a thought which I have in making sure the business is prepared for the future.
Thanks, Malik. I think this is actually a really good point, that it's always important to sort of bring back to mind the problem. The question is not whether technology will be there, right? The question is just how can we use it in a way that is disruptive and that helps us. Stefan earlier provided a couple of sort of advice on sort of what is sort of some areas where we could invest in, what are sort of the main buttons and triggers that we need to push in order for sort of for the impact to maximize. And Stefan, I want to ask you now, because both Michael as well as Nancy and Malik have now really laid out sort of some of the characteristics of a future ready business. And it's interesting because some economist impact studies have actually shown that because of this digital preparedness, a lot of companies that have been very tech ready and digital driven are now on a course of expansion. They've done pretty well throughout the pandemic. And whenever there's sort of a course of expansion, it means as well that we need to hire more people. And the question now is, as we need to hire more people, what do you think are the the new skills that companies should look out for when they sort of trying to attract talent? What is the right what's the talent of the future that companies would be trying to attract at the moment?
Well, it might be not so different than we looked into maybe in the last couple of years in that. So, I mean, number one, I would say digital literacy in all aspects. So what we certainly need is data experts. You need to more have overarching skills like analytical thinking, complex problem solving capabilities. You need to have creativity. You need to have an openness for learning, lifelong learning. So it doesn't help if we keep kind of the status which we learned 10 years ago or 20 years ago at university. So, I mean, we need to constantly upgrade our knowledge there. And if it comes to a leadership perspective, I would also include that we also need to be capable of more like emotional intelligence, inclusive leadership style. So because I think that is maybe one of the most crucial topics which we face these days. I mean, we talked many years about a war for talent. I can tell you my experience is it just started. So we are all short of excellent resources. It is absolutely important that we create something like a culture of trust, a sense of belonging, where we can kind of be inclusive in bringing people in there, that we kind of provide them with an environment where they can kind of bring in their best talent, their thoughts, their creativity, their innovative potential. So if we do not do that, I mean, we can kind of hire all day long and we will not fulfill the demands which we have.
And just to follow up on that, Stefan, as we talk about sort of the hiring and sort of what we need to do, and make sure that sort of on top of sort of technical skills, emotional intelligence is something that is quite key, especially for sort of leadership position. Specifically, as we bring the discussion to sort of the German context, what do you think are sort of some of the pinch points? Are there some bottlenecks in this process that we might want to encounter? Or do you see any challenges or obstacles there, or is this sort of the path clear for talent and hiring? Or what's the situation like in looking now, and how will it change in the next years?
I mean, we need to be willing to go maybe different roads than we did in the past. So, I mean, it is not done to just post a job in one of the extremely spoken printed newspapers. So that doesn't work anymore. So we really need to look into doing more active search. We need to kind of look into creating hackathons and events where we kind of directly get in touch with potential candidates, where they can experience also the culture of the company, the values of the company. So I think that is getting more and more important, and it changes also the role of HR in the company. So how are we really doing hiring? So we heard it earlier on in a different context. It's not just about fulfilling certain KPIs. So it is really kind of also bringing that mindset into the company on all levels, where we say, well, we need to kind of maybe go the extra mile to find those digital experts, because I truly believe they determine our future.
That it will be hard to find them, so we need to train them actually. It will be really fine to find. Finding is good luck.
Yeah, and we need, of course, also kind of to invest in the people we have. So, I mean, the question was more like into hiring, but I think the topic of retaining talent is equally important.
Yeah.
So we have
let me also briefly comment on this, if I may. I think that's an interesting discussion we are having. And when I also hear retaining talent and whatever, and many years ago, talked to a person on the DLD in Munich, and he said, hey, Michael, I stopped recruiting or even doing job interviews because I figured out 50% of the times I'm anyhow wrong. And I'm now engaged into a more dynamic and liquid sourcing. And one aspect is, of course, at Malik, you also mentioned this, like the partnerships and the trust and the teaming. Yeah? and so that we only succeed together. One aspect is, of course, to think about, yeah, where do those talents sit? Do they belong to a company, or could we come also to a new operating model? We, for example, in Vipro, we have a company that is called Top Coder, where we have access to roughly 1.5 million individuals around the globe who are not employed with us, but who engage on a project basis into delivery. And this is what we want to extend, because this gives access, to always the same resources, because they like what they are doing, but they are working independently. And for me, the aspect, I fully agree with Nancy, we need to train people. And this especially, you asked it, Walter, what happens in Germany. We still have a huge gap there and could invest much more. I'm also personally engaged in that, to focus more on education also for the societies where education is not at the level where it should be. So a huge gap we still need to cross. But I personally think we will also need to differently think about the talents and how to engage them best. And this is, again, we don't have all the answers yet, but we are in more innovative ways, like with the top coder approach, looking into this to ensure that the talents work on objectives, which create results for the purpose of building business solutions.
Thank you, Michael. So it seems like, and I noticed that it's sort of like the involvement of everyone in this particular topic here. Talent is one of the prerequisites, really, when we talk about digital preparedness, when we talk about the future in general. And that requires not only one approach. I started with asking Stefan about, well, hiring. And Nancy comes and mentions, well, it's actually also about the general formation. And as well, Michael, I think an approach that I think you've outlined that I think is also quite just equally as important is the fact of hiring external people, maybe keeping people on a project basis, which could cultivate to a sort of wider community of flexibility and talent. And before we wrap up, because I think we're almost out of time now. Malik, there is one final question that I actually uh, wanted to ask you, because it is clear that Germany and sort of our discussion has shown that there is definitely a lot of policy momentum and a lot of momentum in sort of investments and business. And what is sort of the main trend that now, as we move forward, to conclude this, what is sort of a trend that you think uh, is going to happen in the next few years?
I think for me, in Germany, one thing which surprises me, being a person who came out from a different country, coming here 2 years. I think the adaptability of the society is significantly faster in this place. Right, when we started talking about cloud journeys, when we started talking about the adopting new way of working, it really goes in. However, what I'm looking at, future talent comes from a global pool. It doesn't need to be at one place. That talent pool is available. The other thing which Stefan also mentioned, it is basically, I personally feel it's not a job of HR to get the people. HR can be 4 or 5 people on a function of, when I have about 1,500 people function, I can't have HR to hire for me. Individually, all of us need to be brand ambassadors. We have to become our own HR. We have to have that culture that I want to hire people. It is not the HR job anymore. So those changes are significantly happening in this market from a talent perspective. Technology, I think the adoption of technology will accelerate. Technologies are available. The beauty is about the compute. The beauty is about, it's a multitude of technologies. Ability to bring all these technologies together is going to be the biggest challenge. That's what we call it at the usual system integration, or bringing people together to deliver what is needed for the customers.
Thank you very much, Malik. First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this discussion today. I think it's been an incredibly colorful and an incredibly fruitful discussion, and I'm sure that our audience has enjoyed the discussion a lot as well. There are really a few key points that have emerged that I think are particularly interesting. In Germany, similar as in the rest of the world, the pandemic has really been a wake-up call for businesses to accelerate their digitization. But as we move forward with investments and reform, it really seems that data will be at the center of sort of the business of the future. But also looking beyond the technology, making sure that the right talent is hired, as well as staying environmentally sustainable, will be of crucial importance. I would like to thank Michael, Nancy, Malik, and Stefan really for taking their time for speaking with us today, as well as Wipro Limited, our sponsor, for enabling today's discussion. I'd also like to invite at this point the audience to please check out the other two events. You can register at economist.com and see the other webinars there. We have one specific to Switzerland as well as one specific to the UK. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you back soon.